Welcome to everyone to this session in which we're going to discuss policing and the police. And today our panelists are Kathleen Kim, Professor of Law, and William M. Raines Fellow, who is, among other things, a nationally recognized expert on immigrants' rights and human trafficking, and who has served as a commissioner on the LAPD's Civilian Oversight Commission. We also have Professor Priscilla Ochan, Professor of Law, and herself a nationally recognized expert on the relationship between race, gender, and systems of punishment. And Professor Ochan is currently a commissioner on the Los Angeles Sheriff Department's Civilian Oversight Commission. My name is Eric Miller. I'm a professor and Leo J. O'Brien Fellow of Law at LMU Loyola Law School, Los Angeles. And my scholarship focuses on policing and race, as well as specialized criminal courts. So that's who we are. We're all professors at Loyola Los Angeles, LMU. We've got to get all of that in these days, don't we? And what we thought we would do is just start with some questions for each of us. And we thought the first one would be for me, which is how can we put the current moment protesting, policing, and police violence in the context of current constitutional constraints on policing? And I think the most important thing to recognize is just how little the Constitution has to say about who the police are and what the police do. For the most part, the Fourth Amendment tells us something about the public. It tells us that we have rights to privacy and, more recently, property that the police are bound to respect, and that the police should not interfere with those rights unless they have good reason to believe that we are involved in some crime. But most of policing occurs outside the Fourth Amendment constitutional sphere. So, for example, we hear all the time that the police have a duty to protect the public, but just recently the Supreme Court in Town of Castle Rock versus Gonzalez said that the police actually don't have an affirmative duty to protect the public, even if the state, in this case Colorado, creates a statute designating specific instances where there is such a duty. So the court totally punted the question of what is it that the police do? In policing, often the most momentous decision is where to distribute policing. Where should the police activity be concentrated? Which communities are going to get more policing than others? But the court in 1996 in United States versus Armstrong said that this distributive decision is, for the most part, totally up to law enforcement themselves, even if you can show that the police target Black and brown communities, so long as the police can point to some crime enforcement rationale. If the impact of these various decisions produces racist policing, then the court said in a couple of cases, Rizzo versus Good and City of Los Angeles versus Lyons, that for the most part, we, the public, don't have standing to challenge those decisions unless we are likely to be targeted by the police in the future. So you have to show that the police are going to arrest you. Even if you succeed, Rizzo versus Good said that court should be hands-off in proposing remedies. And then finally, on the street, the police can plausibly characterize individual challenges to the police, so people asking the police why they're doing what they're doing, as a form of resistance, and escalate up the use of force continuum to impose physical constraints, including handcuffs, that's Mueller versus Mena, for pretty much any reason if they can show that there is plausibly some kind of crime being created. And then we're all familiar with the deadly force rules and their the idea that so long as the police have a reasonable basis for using deadly force in Graham versus O'Connor, then they get to do so. And so because both Black and white people know this, we see the Amy Cooper phenomenon, in which white folks are willing to weaponize policing to ensure that Black folks know their place and stay in their place, which in cases like Calendar versus Lawson means out of white neighborhoods, and in Chicago versus Morales means not congregating on street corners for no apparent reason. So I think it's this free rein that courts have given the police to engage in everyday, low-level, race-targeted harassment that has led, among other things, to the current dissatisfaction with the lack of police accountability. And it's this low-level lack of accountability, as much as the ever-present threat of egregious violence, currently justified under Graham versus Connor, that has led to, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement and the broader dissatisfaction that the public is expressing with policing as normal. So that's my take on the background. Kathleen, I guess the question is, what can we do about it? So there's a bunch of proposals floating around: ending qualified immunity for the police, creating a duty for officers to intervene when they see other officers doing bad stuff, retraining using implicit bias or procedural justice. You were police commissioner on the LAPD Civilian Oversight Commission. What do you think of these proposals, and what do you think might work?
Thanks, Eric, and thanks for contextualizing these issues for us. For those of you who don't know or aren't familiar, with Eric's scholarship, you should definitely take some time to look at it, because he's been contextualizing these issues for a long time. In particular, the question I'm concerned with, and why I accepted the appointment to the LAPD Police Commission in 2013, was because I was persuaded that by taking that position, I would be able to wield power and influence over an institution, the LAPD, that could actually advance public safety norms. And so public safety norms in the sense of making communities feel safe in their own communities, that policing in its optimal functioning. And this is another point that Eric had pointed out to me earlier, I think probably towards the end of my time on the commission, but the model of policing as peace officer, which is in contrast to the model of policing that we have come to know in the United States as just an outgrowth and with a through line that derives from slavery and fugitive slave gangs. So those were the public safety model, or keeping peace and making communities feel safe, helping to make communities feel safe, is this aspirational goal that we have clearly not achieved. And when I joined the LAPD Commission in 2013, we had a new mayor, and LAPD had just gone through 12 years of strict federal government oversight and a federal consent decree. And these are some of those reforms that have been and are still being discussed to ensure that the LAPD was acting constitutionally. And the police commission in Los Angeles are thought of as the most powerful in the United States, because they are actually, at least by city charter, the head of the police department. And by the federal consent decree, the police commission was made to monitor the completion or fulfillment of all these different things that the federal Department of Justice had determined that LAPD was violating in terms of the constitutional rights of civilians. During my 3 years on the LAPD Police Commission, even though the consent decree had just been lifted, we still kept as a mandate to ensure constitutional policing, which required adjudication of these officer-involved shooting cases, but also compliance of the LAPD with maybe 100 other different points of interest. And the thing is, I think that that amount of oversight begs the question of or raises the question as to legitimacy of policing in the United States as it's persisted. When you have layer upon layer upon layer of oversight to ensure that a government entity that is charged with protecting and serving the community, but is doing the opposite. And so that's why there has to be a DOJ investigation, then a federal court, then a civilian oversight commission, then an inspector general, and then now congressional intervention, federal congressional intervention, just to eliminate tactics and police tactics that have been determined to be cruel and unusual punishment, then we must question the legitimacy of policing as it exists in the United States. And I think, and Eric knows more about this, and Priscilla does too, I'm sure, that there are international models that wouldn't necessarily put policing at odds with the community. And I think we are at a point, it doesn't matter what the good faith intentions of individual police officers are. There are individuals that went into policing to improve the police department because they observed as children the abuses that police officers inflicted in their communities. Or maybe they had, their police officers went into the department because they had a role model that was a police officer who actually helped them. So those individual reasons don't need to be discounted. But once joining an entity, and this is where systemic issues really become important, and where it just becomes fact. It's fact. It's that the system of policing, and what I saw, quote unquote, from the inside, is constantly reinforces violence to resolve conflict even when there isn't conflict, just when there's perceived criminal conduct, which is not violent by its nature. There could be loitering, criminal conduct that's not really criminal. Drug transactions. Why do those have to escalate into violent encounters? And I think that's the default mode for police officers. Unfortunately, I think the police academy is designed to train officers that don't otherwise have a prerequisite of an undergraduate degree, let's say, to increase their critical thinking in situations, and then they're just thrown into an environment where they're learned tactical training to resolve conflicts through violence, both non-lethal tactics and lethal tactics. And those non-lethal tactics turn into lethal tactics. The use of a taser is supposed to be preferred. That's an incremental reform, that departments make. But it's lethal when the suspect that the police tase is a story above them, and then that person falls and dies, right? So that's just an example of a case that we adjudicated, and obviously voted for its out of policy and unconstitutionality determination. I don't want to talk too long, except I just simply want to add a point about social movements, because I started on the police commission when Beale was also launching in earnest. This is 2013. 2014, Michael Brown was killed. 1 month later, Edsel Ford was killed in LA, a young unarmed Black man. Again, there's no criminal activity that that was happening. And these are beat cops. They're supposed to keep an eye out, keep the peace. But it's often these beat cops that are escalating innocent encounters into violent encounters. There are other levels of policing, that SWAT, that's only brought in when there's an active shooter situation or some kind of domestic terrorism situation. And then there are other levels of policing that's pure intelligence. They sit behind the computer, but the majority of police are rank and file cops that are on the streets, driving around, walking around, and they're supposed to keep an eye out looking for criminal conduct. And again, the default mode is some kind of violent interaction. That's what they are looking for, and that's what I think that the system teaches them, reinforces. So BLM started up in earnest, and 2016, the very end of 2016 is when I resigned, and it had become a very strong movement. And I had misgivings about being on the police commission for a while after sort of becoming aware of the co-optation of the notion of civilian oversight to legitimize the police and to support the notion that the policing entity is actually interested in community interest. And those feelings of co-optation and that knowledge of illegitimacy caused me to resign. And I credit the BLM movement for pushing their agenda, and because without that kind of voice in the room, we wouldn't be where we are today. And with that, I want to hand the mic over to Priscilla, because she is currently on the Sheriff's Commission and has some very important insights for us.
Yeah, so I want to talk about the efficacy of some of the reforms that have been proposed, ranging from 8 Can't Wait to the abolition of qualified immunity, to body-worn cameras, to redefining lawful use of force, particularly deadly force by law enforcement, which was recently passed in the state of California last year, after nearly 100 years of having the same actually unconstitutional standard on the books, which requires some de-escalation and also requires the use of alternatives before resort to deadly force, which are huge gains, which were hard fought over the objections of district attorneys and police unions. And so we've made some gains in terms of reform. And there are now pushes to expand civilian oversight bodies across the country. As Professor Kim said, I'm currently on the Sheriff Civilian Oversight Commission, and I agree with what Professor Kim said. All too often, civilian oversight bodies are used as window dressing to mask real deep systemic problems with law enforcement, owing to its very foundation of policing labor disputes, putting down unions in the North, protecting the interests of tycoons in the north of the country, slave patrols in the South, operating on the front lines of white supremacy and policing the boundaries of racial segregation and Jim Crow, and refusing outright to desegregate after the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And in fact, law enforcement has been the most recalcitrant, I think, of many industries in terms of compliance with anti-discrimination law and desegregation. So that's the backdrop against which we have been asked to provide oversight over an institution that has, although it is aggressively policing others, has refused that same sort of policing and oversight of itself. So for example, on the Civilian Oversight Commission, there are 9 of us. We're appointed by the Board of Supervisors, but we don't have the same kind of authority that the LAPD commissions that it has with regard to use of force incidents or civilian complaints. We don't have the ability to in fact, write policies and ensure that those policies are implemented within the department. We only recently got subpoena power, which is been a foundation of the LAPD Commission. And in fact, the sheriff, having received those 2 subpoenas, has decided to defy them, arguing that the will of the voters, Measure R, which was recently passed in March, is unconstitutional. So against that backdrop, here's what I think. Incremental reform. There's 2 kinds of reforms, I think. There's reformist reform, which actually makes a difference in terms of how police function and reduces their footprint in society. Over time, we have invested so much in law enforcement, $3 billion in the city of Los Angeles, constituting over 50% of the budget, more than that in the county, over $3 billion we spend on the sheriff's department. And that doesn't include all of the other municipalities in the county that have their own law enforcement agencies. So we've invested a lot in law enforcement. And so law enforcement becomes the go-to for all kinds of social problems, from homelessness to mental illness to domestic violence to poverty to, again, racial inequality and racial segregation in housing. Police become the answer. And so reforms, I think, if they're going to be effective, have to reduce the footprint of law enforcement, which is why I do endorse the defund, reinvest campaigns that Black Lives Matter and other organizations have put forward. And here's why I say that. I say that we need to divest and reinvest, because I don't think policing can actually be reformed in this country in the way that many liberal reformers think that they can. And here's why. Drawing a lot on what Erica said, and in a project that I'm working on now, I argue that the police are anti-democratic, and so they cannot be reformed by democratic institutions. Here are a few examples of how law enforcement is anti-democratic. They routinely defy federal court orders, right? So you can see this in terms of Los Angeles, although there have been some changes. The issues that the federal consent decrees were attempting to get at are still very much present, because they have, while they may announce the policies, they actually are not complying with the policies that the institution themselves have adopted. Police routinely lie on the stand. It's so common that it's called testifying, and there's no consequence for this kind of behavior. Police routinely reject directives from civilian leadership that are supposed to govern them. So we can look at one of the prime examples in New York City, when de Blasio and others essentially rescinded the stop and frisk policies. In that case, the police essentially staged, in my view, a bloodless coup. They began to try to undermine the mayor. And this includes significant spending by police unions that attempt to, in my view, I think it's inappropriate for law enforcement to be spending on district attorney races and mayoral races. In many ways, they subvert democratic norms that are attempting to regulate them by engaging in this kind of behavior. They routinely disrupt evidence gathering, particularly when it comes to body-worn cameras. I know there were some questions in the chat about body-worn cameras. Often police will not release them in a timely manner. They'll allow the officer who is at issue in terms of a use of force to review that evidence before making any kind of statements. And so again, this disrupts the transparency that we expect with regard to body-worn cameras, and it subverts basic norms around accountability. We often can't even see see the personnel records of law enforcement because of the way that they're protected, both by their collective bargaining contracts and by state law. And no other profession has this kind of protection. And again, it's because of the way that law enforcement has inserted itself into the democratic process. We wouldn't allow the military to do this because of concerns about the subversion of the democratic process. And yet we allow law enforcement in our communities domestically to do this. And we see the outcome. Police have an outsized role in civil society in a way that subverts democratic norms. And therefore, those norms cannot put a check on their power. So the only way to do that, in my view, is to limit their size and scope and their interaction with the public to true emergencies. And that means we have to rearrange fundamentally how society is organized, how resources are distributed, and how we use the criminal law. So I'll stop there. But at the end of the day, I think that we do have to reimagine what safety looks like and redefine the role of law enforcement in civil society.
Well, that's great. There are some questions in the chat. I want to encourage folks to use the chat if you want to pose questions. There's also a Q&A box that if folks want to use it, I will learn how it works on the fly. But so a couple of points from the chat. So Priscilla touched briefly on the use of police body-worn cameras. So one quick comment, and then perhaps a question for Priscilla and Kathleen. So the comments are that the Sheriff's Department does not require body-worn cameras. The LAPD does require body-worn cameras. So we have two different local police institutions that take very different approaches to body-worn cameras. My sense is from the criminal defense bar that body-worn cameras at least give an opportunity for, Priscilla was talking about testifying, a sort of different view, and that body-worn cameras have often been quite useful in some criminal cases to contradict the view of the police. And we've seen that in some of the recent police responses around the country to the protests, where body-worn cameras have contradicted statements that the police have made about use of force. So I guess we heard a little bit from Priscilla. Kathleen, do you have any thoughts on body-worn cameras?
Yeah, so so during the time that I was on the commission, and I should have said a little bit more, we were able to make reforms, and by some standards, they might have been considered dramatic reforms, like requiring all LAPD sworn officers to wear body cameras and to initiate them. And we had back and forth with the police union and with command staff about how to draft policies that would use cameras in the way that they were intended to act as an accountability tool and a deterrence tool. There was so much power wielded by the police union and their perception of unfairness. And you know, by the way, this is not, I think it's really important to differentiate the individual from institutional actors, and the police union is the institutional actor. And a lot of cops, while they might be well-intentioned and be very happy to have the cameras and have to turn them on because then they can hold other officers accountable, or whatever, or just capture the incident. They also, I think there's a lot of pressure to join the police union to gain all those kinds of collective bargaining benefits that that they wouldn't otherwise gain. That's actually a problem with the entity of policing, that a police union that's driven by both sort of, you know, I guess wanting to advance labor rights, but also is very entrenched with racist views and power values, you know. So so I think that's a reason that I would agree with Priscilla to just get, well, I say dismantle policing. But anyway, so the cameras did go into place. Their officers were given permission to watch the video. But the video was also simultaneously could be seen by the internal investigators, police commissioners, and command staff. So there were supposed to be layers of layers to ensure, you know, that cops didn't lie in their testimony. Supposed to be immediate separation of any officers that are involved in a fatal incident or involve lethal force. Another reform measure that we changed the use of force policy, and that's the one that California adopted. Our commission did that. And it was during the time that I was on there. But in spite of these, what I mean, like some reformists might think are dramatic reforms, I just firmly believe it's not enough, because I met cops, detectives, lieutenants, other command staff who I think are smart people who, you know, want to do good things, but those people shouldn't be police officers. Because the institution itself, in spite of reforms that even those officers advanced, and supported, is not going to change the culture. Is not going to change the culture and institution that dates back to, I'd say, the colonization of the United States. And unfortunately, Chief Beck was the chief when I was on the commission, and he said in my first meeting with my first official one-on-one meeting with him, he said people either love cops or they hate cops. You have to just figure out where you are, on that spectrum, or lack of a spectrum. That's not helpful, because it's not an individual. I mean, maybe he wasn't. Maybe he was speaking to something more abstract. I'm not sure. And then the other thing he said was the police department is a big ship to steer, so it takes a long time. And in my own recent writing about these issues, I was thinking, well, if it's a big ship, if it's too big to steer, maybe let it sink.
Yeah, I mean, on that point, I mean, on body-worn cameras, I was on the commission when this came forward. And I was not convinced that body-worn cameras were the solution, partially because of cost. The sheriff's department floated a cost of something like $300 million to do the program, and I felt that those kinds of funds would be better spent elsewhere on mental health, housing for homeless people or unhoused people, on anti-poverty programs. Instead of body-worn cameras for law enforcement. I understand, I do think they are a good harm reduction strategy. I think folks put too much on body-worn cameras as if it will change the behavior of officers, when in fact, the studies on this are a bit mixed in terms of whether or not the officer's behavior is changed. And then the footage that they capture certainly can be used to contradict an officer's testimony about a particular incident. But when it comes to fatal use of force, which is obviously where this becomes most salient and when this conversation comes up most often, it doesn't tell us objectively whether the officer was reasonable to fear for their lives or to fear for the lives of others in the public. And so we can look at case after case after case where there's both body camera and civilian footage that's been captured, Eric Garner for one, and there's been no criminal liability imposed. So the camera footage can tell us sort of what happened, but it doesn't solve the legal question as to whether a crime has been committed by law enforcement. And I'll tell you a story that sort of brings together both the body camera sort of witnessing an incident and how police often sell use of force incidents. So myself, along with another commissioner with the Sheriff's Civilian Oversight Commission, participated in a training for officers and clinicians who to learn how to de-escalate situations with people who are having mental health crises. As many folks who are watching this know, people with disabilities are about 50% of the victims of fatal police use of force. And so obviously this is a big issue. And many of the people who are in our jails and prisons are mentally ill. So we went through the exercise. It's sort of a simulation where you interact. It's sort of choose your own adventure depending how you react to the subject on a screen. It shifts, it may escalate, it may de-escalate, and you have to respond. And there's someone who's in the command staff or training bureau with the department who kind of shifts the training. So the person may get more agitated or less depending how you interact with them. So me and another commissioner, we went through the training. We were given fake tasers, fake guns, and we were able to successfully de-escalate. On a couple of occasions, we were given sort of notes or feedback that we should have drawn our weapons. We should have pointed our weapons when a suspect, for example, balled up their fist or put their hand on a butter knife. Which I thought was a bit curious. That would seem to me to escalate a situation, but that was the feedback we were given. We then stepped aside, again, having de-escalated the force scenarios we were given, not having to use any kind of force to gain compliance and to ensure the safety of everybody involved. we stepped aside and we were invited to watch a deputy and a clinician go through the same exercise that we had. The deputy was moving through the exercises, and on the last one, he was confronted with someone who had a knife who was threatening to kill themselves. And was obviously very agitated. And at one point, the subject threw the knife and charged at the deputy. The deputy drew their fake gun and shot the person, killing them. The simulation ended, and the trainer said that shooting was out of policy. The person was unarmed. You could have used less than lethal force to ensure your safety. And the deputy didn't admit any kind of fault, didn't say, oh, that was wrong. I should have tried, I was scared or whatever. I may have overreacted. None of that sort of contrition, right? Or receiving the feedback. Instead, what he said was, I could have sold it. I could have sold it. I could have sold that shooting. And that, unfortunately, is the attitude of far too many officers. They know that they can articulate, I feared for my life. Even if objectively, if you look at it, the person was unarmed, I was afraid. And so I shot that person. And 99.99% of the time, even if that's filmed, even if the incident is witnessed, that will be deemed justified. That's enough. Because not only of the culture of policing, that there's sort of the blue wall of silence, and there are code words that officers are taught to use to justify use of force, but then also the public's perception that law enforcement should be given wide latitude to use force because of the difficulty of their jobs. And so that's why I think while body-worn cameras may be a form of harm reduction, I don't think we should overemphasize their transformational possibilities because of these headwinds that we face around institutional culture and, frankly, our cultural views of law enforcement and policing. So I'll pause there.
I want to take this back to Eric right away. Just a couple thoughts that reforms enable the policing institution as we know it, and the reforms, while seen as dramatic by some, becoming too incremental, and without getting to the root cause and problems. I think that there needs to be transformation in policing, and then the other thing was that I went through the FOSS training simulator that Priscilla was just describing. Within 2 seconds, more than that, 30 seconds, I died. I mean that I didn't use lethal force, and I think maybe they were. I don't know. That's all I want to say. And so
but I think that is a part of the training of law enforcement is to come in. The training that they get emphasizes us versus them, right? That law enforcement are constantly under threat, and if it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission, and better to go home to your family rather than to err on the side of caution. So that's really, and that was emphasized to us that had we hesitated, we could be dead, and so that's the kind of training that police get. And even if they get training around de-escalation, the informal training, the sort of shadow institution tells them otherwise and will protect them when they act on that sort of that cultural guidance that they get from senior officers around when and how to use force, particularly when they're in Black and Brown communities. One, where many are often very excited to be because they think that this is the opportunity where they can use that training because they may be seen as high crime neighborhoods. So that's really the core of this, is the culture that we simply have not been able to dismantle with consent decrees, with civilian oversight bodies, with body-worn cameras. That culture has been inherent in law enforcement for hundreds of years.
I know that there are a bunch of questions in the audience. I had a question for Professor Miller. What are the alternatives? So I think we all agree that these reform measures, even if considered dramatic, is not enough. Like the Minneapolis City Council said, our police department is not reformable, therefore we will dismantle it. We have a sense of what the frontline needs are for communities, especially vulnerable communities. And what do you envision as feasible alternatives?
And I also want to note here that we have a couple of questions in the chat about qualified immunity.
Okay.
And whether the abolition of qualified immunity will advance the ball in any kind of significant way.
So, so one reform is by abolishing qualified immunity, and going along with that, I think to make it bite, we would. So one proposal is to actually remove the budget that pays for police judgments against the police from the city and the county, and get private insurance to pay for it, because it turns out that private insurance is much more aggressive in pushing police reform policies because they have financial incentives to doing it. But I do think that there's a debate as to whether removing qualified immunity is enough, for reasons that Priscilla and Kathleen have given about resistance to change. You know, I think that one major, one important point to note is that the police mission ought to be social justice. And I think part of the reason that things have come to such a head is that the social justice aspect of the police mission has been so marginalized in terms of aggressive forms of policing. So crime fighting has substituted for social justice in too many different areas of policing. And so there's a real question as to whether it's enough simply to adopt new regulations, or whether you want to disempower the police by removing the police from engaging in certain types of policing. And so one thing to recognize is we remove the police all over the place. Private police do work in malls and in fancy gated communities, and they do so in a way that isn't adversarial, at least to the members of the gated communities. And so people in those communities are policed very differently by excluding the police and having a different force work there. In transit, there's a big move now to remove, in places like New York especially, the NYPD from policing transit, because the problems that mostly occur in transit, so unhoused people, people with mental health problems, people with alcohol problems, people seeking shelter, can be dealt with by a variety of different groups that don't have as their mission to criminalize the conduct. So you might see that part of the police reform movement is a decriminalization movement. And so I think there are two real strands at the moment. One strand is a strand that wants to work with the police to encourage the police to do de-escalation. Another strand is one that thinks that is unachievable, and says that because we can't achieve this through the police, we want other people to do this type of policing. And and so I think the last is what the divest and deform movement is about. It's one way of thinking about it is giving power back to teachers, transit workers, and other people to take some responsibility for security around those institutions. I hope, so, there's a long-term goal, the short-term goal. I think the long and short-term goals are now coalescing, and so people are no longer convinced that the police are generally reformable. I do worry that if we focus too much on leaving the police mission as purely crime fighting, then it's going to simply keep the police organized around the use of force. I think that there's a place to have a discussion about that. Someone in the chat asked about our Policing Los Angeles forum, and I do believe that there should be opportunities, even in the current heightened political context, for activists, public, police, scholars, and the criminal justice bar to get together and try and talk, negotiate, hear each other, think about short-term reforms, even while these other more drastic reforms are happening. But maybe, that is, I don't know whether that is more or less achievable in the current climate. But I do think that what we're seeing is a response to a certain refusal to negotiate. We've talked a little bit about police unions. There's a question as to whether police unions are reformable, and whether we should get state reforms of police unions. I think that's difficult, in part because police unions exist at this weird confluence of the people that want to talk in terms of security, as well as people who want to promote labor unions. I think actually the real problem is likely to be that it's the city that refuses to uphold its part of the negotiating bargain. Like, we want our mayor to actually negotiate hard against the police and to reject some of the stuff that the police union demands, rather than supinely accept some of the things that the police union demands. So, all of this is to say, I actually think that policing is quite a complex business. And I think that the reforms around policing are quite complex, but what we're seeing now is a movement, not simply, defund the police is one way of thinking it, but the other way of thinking about it is to refuse to criminalize certain activities and to have someone else empowered to interact with the public in places of crises. And I think it's right to question whether the police ought to be the first responders in those situations. And, I'd hope that the law enforcement community would embrace that discussion, because I think for a lot of law enforcement professionals, they don't want to be the person engaging with the public in those sorts of scenarios. And so it may be that there is actually more agreement than some of the more, extreme voices on law enforcement, but maybe in the community are willing to acknowledge on, or in our local politics, on moving the police out of some of the stuff that the police perhaps ought not to be doing and don't want to do anyway.
Just to add on to Eric's comments, those are all extremely informative, or all the suggestions, and you raised some things that I hadn't thought of. And just in talking about, what can be done with departments now, just even the divide between union and departmental command staff is quite distinct, and they're at odds. They're constantly at odds. So when the command staff, first of all, LAPD, for those of you, is very differently structured than the sheriff's department. I'm not saying that the culture, institutional culture, is not very alike, but they're structured differently. The chief of police is appointed by the mayor. So political leadership, of which what Professor Miller was just raising, is incredibly important. The sheriff is elected. So political leadership in the sheriff would certainly help, and then
Also,
with LAPD.
on that point, Kathleen, there have been some suggestions that sheriffs should not be elected, that they should be appointed by boards of supervisors.
Right. Yeah.
I don't know where that will go, but that's that way there will be more ongoing supervision rather than every 4 years.
Right. I mean, they can be fired. They're at least accountable to someone. And so in the LAPD, the command staff, the department itself is sued by the union anytime these reforms happen. When we passed the use of force reform, we got sued. When we mandated body cameras, we got sued. When we required officers to not impound the cars of uninsured drivers because acknowledging that most of them were undocumented, and they would just lose their car, we got sued. So there are all. It's so complex and multi-layered. That's all I wanted to add.
And I think we're running out of time, but I think this demonstrates that we should have another conversation, and maybe we can dive more into some of the nuances. I wanted to acknowledge there was a question about the link between law enforcement and white supremacist infiltration, for example. And I think that point, that history has been well documented. The Justice Department under the Obama administration issued a warning about this issue. So it certainly is a dynamic, but I wouldn't want to overstate that. I think that kind of gives some cover or excuse to what we're seeing. And this isn't about white supremacists, infiltrating law enforcement, although it does happen, and it is a big problem that should be rooted out. This is about the culture of law enforcement itself, which is rooted in many ways in white supremacy. So I think that's really the issue that most of us are interested in talking about, although to the questioner's point, it has been documented. Just on the last point, I know we're running out of time, I want to kind of amplify this moment and what movement leaders and activists are calling for. It's not just an end to the way that police function as we know it. It's an end to policing as we know it. And that's an important distinction that I wanted to highlight, because that means it's not just the police. It also means it's our schools, right? We've adopted a policing mentality in our schools. We've adopted a policing mentality when it comes to social welfare, for example. In a lot of other areas of civil life, we have adopted a very punitive law enforcement approach that we really need to take, I think, a hard look at. And there are other countries that are just as complicated, just as diverse as ours, that are able to ensure safety without subordinating and abusing the most vulnerable in their communities. And we ought to reject this sort of form of American exceptionalism and look to them. And I hope that we'll be able to have another conversation about alternatives to our current system of policing and imprisonment at another time. And I hope that the 125 of you that joined us today will join us again for that conversation, and we can have further dialogue about this.
Yeah, and if I can just jump in, I mean, Professor Sean Kennedy and I, but also helped by Professors Kim and O-Chen, run a Policing Los Angeles forum. We are looking to restart the forum for the fall semester. It will almost certainly be online. We'll announce our slate of topics hopefully in the next few weeks. But we certainly want Loyola Law School to continue to provide a place where we can discuss police reform and promote conversations that lead towards social justice, safety, reduction of harm for the whole and Los Angeles community, and that's part of our core mission at the law school.
I have nothing to add except to thank Professor Miller and Professor Ocean for leading, being leaders on these issues and allies in this movement.
And thank you all for joining us. Hope everybody stays safe and wear your masks.
Yeah.
All right. Talk to you later.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.